You're really going to let this old man waste your time? Mike's voice cut through the office, dripping with mockery as he leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered across his face. You do realize he's not up to the task anymore, right? The rest of the young staff around the room stifled their chuckles, casting quick, awkward glances toward John Clark, who sat at his desk, his weathered hands lightly resting on the keyboard. Mike, barely out of his 20s, couldn't hold back the condescension in his tone as he continued, we need someone who can actually handle the situation, someone who knows what they're doing. Not him. John's lips barely moved, but his eyes, clear and steady, never wavered from the monitor in front of him. The silence in the room thickened as Mike's words echoed. At 60, John's presence in the office felt almost like an anachronism. He was a relic of a different time, a veteran of wars that most of the young employees couldn't even name. The very idea that John could contribute anything of value to the company's crisis was laughable to them. Yet, there he sat, quietly watching the whirlwind of complaints and panic swirling around him. No one knew the man's story, not the battles he'd fought, nor the lives he'd saved. They only saw his age, his silence, and his slow, deliberate movements. It wasn't long before the tension in the room escalated. Mike turned to his colleague, Alice, and scoffed, I bet he couldn't even explain what's wrong with the system. Look at him. Alice half smiled, uncomfortable with the ongoing ridicule. John's gaze remained fixed, never breaking, as if the words washed over him like a light breeze. He knew what they thought of him, he had been underestimated his whole life, and it had never bothered him. His history wasn't marked by medals or titles displayed on a wall, it was marked by the silent respect of those who truly knew him. I'm here to help, John finally said, his voice calm and low. His words cut through the air, and for the first time in the room, there was a noticeable shift. The sarcasm of Mike, the skepticism of Alice, everything hung on that one statement. You think you can help us fix this? Mike's voice was dripping with disbelief. This is a multi-million-dollar crisis, and you're telling me you can handle it? John's eyes met his, unwavering. I've handled worse. The room fell silent. John's past wasn't something he wore on his sleeve, but those who truly knew him understood the weight of his words. It wasn't about fixing a system issue with just a few clicks, it was about the experience, the years of making decisions under pressure, the ability to see beyond the immediate chaos and find a solution. Alice, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. John, what do you mean by that? He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and walked over to the conference table, his hand resting on the edge as he looked out the window. In my time, he said, his voice steady, we didn't have all the fancy technology you have now. But we had something better, a sharp mind, clear judgment, and the ability to think on our feet. Alice frowned, still unsure what he meant. But how does that help us now? John paused for a moment before answering. In the military, we faced problems that no one thought we could solve. And yet, we did. We did because we worked together, we adapted, and we never gave up. And that's exactly what this company needs now. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the tension shifted. Mike looked around at his colleagues, noticing the subtle shift in their expressions. There was something about the way John spoke, something that didn't fit the image of the old man they had dismissed so easily. He was more than just a relic, he was a force they hadn't accounted for. Without another word, Mike sat back in his chair, his arrogance deflating slightly. John walked back to his desk, pulling up the financial report on his screen. His fingers moved with surprising speed and precision. As the hours passed, the team grew increasingly aware of something they hadn't seen before. John was methodical, resourceful, and completely calm under pressure. He wasn't here to show off or make a grand entrance. He was here to solve the problem, and he was doing it without the need for recognition. The crisis, which had seemed impossible to overcome, slowly began to turn around under John's leadership. And as the team worked alongside him, they realized something: they had underestimated a legend. They hadn't just disrespected an old man, they had dismissed a man who had more wisdom, more experience, and more insight than any of them could have imagined. By the time the crisis was over, John had done more than just fix a problem. He had earned the respect he deserved, without ever asking for it. As the clock ticked into the afternoon, the office was finally beginning to quiet down. The pressure was still palpable in the air, but John Clark's methodical approach was starting to have an effect. His calm demeanor in the face of the crisis was becoming contagious. One by one, the young staff members who had been mocking him earlier began to focus on their tasks with more intent. Mike, still skeptical, couldn't help but glance over at John every now and then. The way he worked was almost mesmerizing. While the rest of the team fumbled with spreadsheets and financial projections, John seemed to know exactly where to look, what to adjust, and how to find the answers. It was as if the answers were all there, hidden in plain sight, and he was the only one who could see them. Mike leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, but his eyes no longer carried the same smug confidence. He was watching John. "What do you think you're doing?" he finally asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. John didn't look up. "I'm solving the problem," he replied simply. His voice was calm, like it was just another day in the office. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to John than he had first assumed. "You're just lucky," Mike muttered under his breath, though the words didn't carry the same force as before. "Lucky?" John repeated, still not looking up. "No. Experience." Mike's eyebrows furrowed, but before he could retort, a sudden change in the atmosphere caught his attention. The team had been stuck for hours, trying to untangle a financial reporting issue that had thrown the company into a crisis. But in the past half hour, John had uncovered a series of overlooked errors in the numbers. He didn't need fancy software or high-tech tools. All he needed was the data and a sharp eye. He pulled out a piece of paper from his desk, jotted down a few calculations, and slid it across the table to Alice. She blinked at it, confused, then turned to the screen. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. This works. How did you?" "Experience," John repeated, finally meeting her gaze. "Sometimes you don't need the best tools to solve a problem. You need the right mindset." Alice stared at him for a moment, a mixture of awe and respect in her eyes. She'd spent the last few days struggling with the same problem, but John had cracked it in a matter of minutes. Her skepticism began to melt away. The rest of the team slowly gathered around as John continued to guide them through the process. It wasn't just the numbers he fixed, it was their approach, their mindset. He showed them how to think through the problem, how to break it down, and how to work together. By the time the team had managed to iron out the details, the crisis had started to dissipate. The tension in the room lifted, and for the first time all day, there was a collective sense of relief. But it wasn't just the problem that was solved. It was something deeper, a shift in perception. Mike, once the biggest skeptic, looked over at John. "You were right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I underestimated you." John nodded, a slight smile on his face. "It's okay," he said. "It happens. The important thing is that we solved the problem together." The room was still, the weight of what had just happened settling in. The young team had learned something they hadn't expected today, not just about the crisis at hand, but about the man they had dismissed so easily. They had underestimated the value of experience, the power of perspective, and the quiet strength of someone who had seen it all. As the day wound down and the last of the files were closed, John gathered his things. He hadn't been looking for recognition, nor had he expected any. But as he walked toward the door, he knew the team would remember today, not just as a day when the crisis was averted, but as the day they learned to never judge someone by their age, their appearance, or their past. The following days after the crisis were marked by a subtle shift in the office. John Clark continued his work, quiet and steady as always, but something had changed in the way the team looked at him. No longer just the elderly man in the corner, he was now a respected figure in the office. Mike, who had once ridiculed him, now found himself seeking John's input on projects. It wasn't out of obligation but out of genuine respect. John's experience had proven to be an invaluable asset, something that Mike, and the rest of the team, could no longer ignore. One afternoon, as the team gathered for their regular meeting, Alice spoke up. "I have to admit," she began, her voice a little hesitant, "I never thought we'd get through that crisis without some major fallout. But, John, you were right. Your way of thinking, the way you broke it all down, it made all the difference." John smiled, his eyes still as calm and steady as ever. "Sometimes, the best solutions come from looking at things from a different angle," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You just need the right perspective." Alice nodded, and the rest of the team followed suit, offering their own acknowledgments. Even Mike, who had initially been the loudest in his skepticism, now gave John a look of genuine respect. "I think I've learned something here," Mike said, his tone much softer than before. "It's easy to underestimate people, especially when they don't fit the mold of what you expect. But experience counts for more than we realize." John didn't respond, simply nodding in acknowledgement. He wasn't one for grand speeches or seeking validation. His work spoke for itself. As the weeks went by, the team began to see even more of John's quiet brilliance. They learned to value his judgment, his ability to stay calm under pressure, and his unique way of solving problems. John never asked for praise. He didn't need it. He had already received the greatest reward, the respect of his peers. His work, and the way he carried himself, proved that age and experience were invaluable. Mike, in particular, began to take a different approach to his own work. Where he had once rushed through tasks, now he found himself considering John's philosophy, slowing down, thinking things through, and taking the time to understand the full picture before making decisions. The change wasn't immediate, but it was evident in the way the team began to approach challenges. They no longer saw John as just a relic of the past, they saw him as a guide, someone whose wisdom and experience could help them navigate the complexities of their work. One day, as John walked into the office, he was greeted by a few of his colleagues. "Hey, John," Alice called out with a smile. "I've got a new problem for you. I've been stuck on this for hours. Think you could give me a hand?" John didn't hesitate. He walked over to her desk, offering his quiet presence as she explained the issue. "Let's take a look," he said simply. As they worked through the problem together, Alice couldn't help but feel grateful for the man who had quietly reshaped the way she thought about work, and about life. John wasn't just solving problems anymore, he was teaching the team a new way of seeing the world. A way that didn't rely on quick fixes or shortcuts but on understanding, patience, and the quiet strength that came with experience. The office had become a quieter place after that day. The usual rush of activity was tempered with a new sense of focus and respect. John Clark's presence, which had once been nothing more than a background figure, now seemed to center the entire office. His slow, deliberate approach had made him a stabilizing force in a world that moved too quickly. The crisis was over, but its impact lingered. John had shown the team something more than just the solution to their problem. He had taught them the power of patience, of experience, and most importantly, of not underestimating someone just because they didn't fit the mold. Mike, who had once been the loudest in his doubts, found himself more reflective now. He no longer saw the office as a battlefield to be won, but as a place to grow and learn. It was an internal shift he hadn't expected, but he welcomed it. He started spending more time with John, asking questions about the old days, about his experiences in the military. John, for his part, was more than happy to share his stories. He didn't speak much about his personal life, but when he did, it was clear he had lived through more than most could ever imagine. One afternoon, Mike caught John on his way out of the office. "Hey, John," he called, a slight hesitation in his voice. "Do you ever talk about what you did before this? I mean, when you were in the service?" John paused and turned, his expression calm as always. "Not much," he said simply. "Why's that?" Mike asked, genuinely curious now. "Not much to talk about," John replied, his voice steady. "I've seen my share of things, but those days are behind me. I prefer to focus on what I'm doing now." Mike nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected. He could see that John's past was something he carried with him quietly, not for recognition, but because it was a part of him. As the weeks passed, the team continued to rely on John's insight. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of seeing the core of any issue, whether it was a problem with a client, a product, or even team dynamics. His approach wasn't flashy, but it was effective. His reputation grew, but not in the way one might expect. People didn't approach him out of obligation or out of fear. They came to him because they respected him, because they knew that his words carried weight, and that he wouldn't give advice without considering every angle. Alice, who had once been uncertain of John's methods, found herself seeking his counsel on a project that was teetering on the edge of failure. "John," she said one afternoon, her voice a mix of frustration and hope. "I don't know what to do with this proposal. We're so close to losing this client. Can you take a look?" John glanced at the proposal, then back at Alice. He didn't immediately offer his thoughts, instead sitting back in his chair and observing. "Sometimes, it's not about the proposal itself," he said after a long pause. "It's about how you present it. How you make the client feel that their concerns are heard and addressed." Alice frowned. "But we've done that already. We've listened. What's left to do?" "Listen harder," John replied, his voice calm. "You've been so focused on fixing the problem that you've overlooked the bigger picture. Sometimes, the best way to solve a problem is to understand what's driving it in the first place." Alice looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She realized that John wasn't just offering advice, he was teaching her how to think, how to approach a situation from a different angle. The client had been frustrated, yes, but that frustration was masking deeper concerns that had gone unaddressed. She felt a shift in her mindset, and she knew what she needed to do. The next meeting with the client went better than expected. By focusing not just on the technical issues, but on the client's broader concerns, Alice was able to regain their trust and keep the deal alive. The victory wasn't just in the result, it was in the way Alice approached the problem, something she had learned from John. The office felt different now. It wasn't just the usual hum of work being done, there was a newfound respect, a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. John Clark's quiet leadership had transformed not only the way the team worked but the way they viewed each other. No longer just colleagues, they were a team, united not just by the work they did, but by the respect they had earned from one another. John, ever humble, never made a big deal out of the changes. He didn't need to. His presence, steady and reliable, was enough. And in that steady presence, the team had found something far more valuable than just a solution to a crisis. They had found a mentor, someone who had shown them that experience, patience, and wisdom were the true keys to success. The transformation in the office had become undeniable. John Clark had slowly but surely changed the atmosphere. What was once a typical office, filled with distractions and egos, had become a place of focus, collaboration, and respect. His quiet influence had permeated everything, no one was questioning his ability anymore, not after everything he had done for the team. One afternoon, the CEO of the company, Greg Thompson, called for a special meeting. The atmosphere was charged, as the entire team gathered in the conference room, wondering what it was about. As everyone settled in, Greg stood at the front of the room, his usual commanding presence filling the space. "I've been watching how things have been progressing around here," Greg began, scanning the room. "We've been through some tough times, but the last few weeks, I've seen something shift." His eyes paused on John, who was sitting quietly at the back of the room. "John," Greg said, his voice carrying a different tone than usual, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. You've turned things around for this company." A murmur spread across the room. John looked up. But his expression remained unchanged. "I've been hearing some incredible things about how you've been working with the team, especially when it comes to problem solving," Greg continued. "And I've come to realize that it's not just about the job you're doing, it's the impact you're having on everyone here. You've shown us all that experience matters. That's something I've been overlooking." John gave a modest smile. "I'm just doing my part," he said simply. The room grew quiet. John didn't want the spotlight, but the respect he had earned was undeniable. Greg turned to the rest of the team. "I'm calling on all of you to take a page from John's book. It's not just about doing the work, it's about how you approach it. How you make those around you better." The team exchanged glances, each of them reflecting on how John's presence had shaped their own work ethic. Mike, who had once dismissed John, now looked at him with a newfound sense of admiration. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," Mike said to John after the meeting, as the team began to file out. "About the bigger picture. I didn't really get it at first, but now I do. You didn't just fix the problem, you taught us how to approach it differently. You made us see things we were overlooking." John nodded. "It's about learning from each other. There's always something new to pick up, no matter how much experience you think you have." Mike smiled. "I think I'm starting to get that." As the days went by, John continued to guide the team in his quiet way. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic speeches. His influence was felt in every conversation, in every meeting. The team began to think differently about their work. They started to focus more on the process, on learning from mistakes, on understanding the why behind the work. It wasn't just about hitting deadlines anymore, it was about getting better, together. John's approach became the standard. People no longer saw him as just the old guy in the office. They saw him as a mentor, someone whose knowledge was invaluable, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew how to ask the right questions. One evening, as John was packing up to leave, Alice approached him. "John, I just wanted to say thanks. I've been struggling with this project, and I've been trying to figure it out on my own. But when I finally asked for your input, you showed me a whole new way to look at it. I never would have thought of that." John smiled warmly. "Sometimes, it just takes a fresh set of eyes. I've been in your shoes before. You'll get there." Alice felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had learned a lot from John in just a short time, but it wasn't just his expertise she appreciated, it was his willingness to share it without hesitation. He didn't make her feel small for asking questions. He made her feel capable of finding her own answers. As John walked out the door, the team continued to work together, more united than ever. They had learned from the best, not through forceful leadership, but through the quiet example set by a man who had seen it all. And as they faced new challenges ahead, they did so with the confidence that came from knowing that experience, patience, and teamwork were the true keys to success. As the months passed, John Clark became more than just a member of the team, he became the quiet pillar that held everything together. The team was thriving. The office was no longer just a place to work, it had transformed into a space of learning and growth, all thanks to John's subtle leadership. He didn't demand attention, but he had earned it. His wisdom was sought after, not just for the big decisions, but for the little ones too. It was in the way he saw the details that others missed. One afternoon, Greg Thompson, the CEO, called John into his office. John wasn't surprised, after all, Greg had become one of his biggest advocates. "John, come in, have a seat," Greg said warmly as John walked in. "How are things going?" John took a seat, his usual calm demeanor unchanged. "Everything's moving forward. We're making progress," he replied simply. Greg leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I've been thinking a lot about the impact you've had on the team," Greg said. "You've changed the way we approach work here. I've heard the team talk about you, they say you've taught them more than just how to solve problems. You've taught them how to think, how to be better." John looked at Greg, slightly surprised. I'm just doing what I know, he said, almost humbly. Greg smiled. That's exactly the point. What you know, what you've experienced, it's invaluable. And I think it's time we recognize that. John raised an eyebrow. Recognize what exactly? I've been talking with the board, Greg said, leaning forward. We think it's time for you to step into a larger role. Not just as an advisor, but as someone who can guide this company from the top. You've already done it with the team. It's time to expand that. John paused, considering the offer. He wasn't looking for recognition, but there was something about Greg's words that made him think. He had been quietly guiding the team for months, and the results spoke for themselves. It wasn't just the success of the projects, but the way the team had grown, how they had become more cohesive, more focused. I don't know if I'm the right person for that, John said slowly, not because he doubted his abilities, but because he had always preferred to stay behind the scenes. Greg chuckled. You're exactly the right person, John. It's not about being flashy. It's about bringing people together, getting them to see what they're capable of. That's what you've done. That's what we need. John thought for a moment. He had always believed that leadership wasn't about titles or positions, it was about making a difference in the lives of those you worked with. And that was something he had done, quietly, without fanfare. All right, John said finally. I'll give it a try. But only if I can still work with the team. I want to continue helping them grow. Greg smiled, clearly pleased with John's decision. Of course. You'll have the opportunity to lead, but you won't be doing it alone. We'll all work together. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings and decisions, as John transitioned into his new role. He wasn't the kind of leader who sought attention or approval. Instead, he quietly observed, listened, and made his presence felt through his actions. His influence grew, not because he was in the spotlight, but because his calm, steady approach inspired those around him to be better. Mike, who had once seen John as just an old man in the office, now looked up to him as a mentor. He had learned more from John in the past few months than he had in years of working in the business world. John, Mike said one day, as they were reviewing a project together, I don't know if I would have made it through the last few months without your guidance. You've really opened my eyes to what's important. John looked at him and smiled. You're doing the work, Mike. I'm just helping you see how to approach it. You've got this. The team, now stronger and more united than ever, knew that their success wasn't just due to the projects they completed or the clients they satisfied. It was because they had learned how to work together, how to grow together. And through it all, they had John to thank for that. As he sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in his title, but in the people around him. They had come a long way, and so had he. It wasn't just about fixing problems anymore, it was about building something lasting. Something meaningful. As John Clark settled into his new role, the company underwent another transformation. The projects kept coming, but now they were handled differently. The focus had shifted from simply meeting deadlines to fostering an environment of growth and collaboration. John had become more than a leader, he was a mentor, a guide who helped the team understand not just what to do, but why they were doing it. One afternoon, Greg Thompson called another meeting, this time to discuss the future of the company. The room was filled with the usual buzz of activity, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that the meeting would be important, but they didn't know just how important. As the team sat down, Greg began, I've been reflecting on where we're headed as a company. We've come a long way, and a big part of that is because of John. He nodded to John, who sat at the front of the room, his usual calm demeanor never changing. But it's not just about the numbers, Greg continued. It's about the culture we're building here. We've learned so much from John, not just about business, but about how to treat each other, how to work together. And that's something that will carry us forward. The team listened, nodding. In agreement. They had all seen the change. It wasn't just the work they were doing, it was the way they were doing it. They were more united than ever. So, Greg said, I think it's time we take the next step. John has done incredible work, but now it's time for us to look beyond just the day-to-day. We need to think about our legacy. How do we want to be remembered? John raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the question. He had never been one to seek glory or recognition, but the idea of leaving a lasting impact did resonate with him. We've built something strong here, Greg continued. But it's not just about us. It's about the next generation. How do we pass on what we've learned? How do we make sure this company continues to thrive for years to come? John leaned forward, his hands resting on the table as he considered the question. It's about empowerment, he said quietly. It's about teaching the next generation to think for themselves, to make decisions with confidence, and to understand the value of experience. The real strength of a company isn't in its technology or its products, it's in the people who make it all happen. Greg nodded thoughtfully. Exactly. And that's why we're going to start a mentorship program. A program where people like John can share their knowledge and help guide the next generation of leaders. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just a decision about business strategy, it was a commitment to the values that had made the company successful in the first place. The team would no longer just be workers, they would be part of something bigger, something that would last. Mike, who had become one of John's most enthusiastic supporters, spoke up. I think this is a great idea. I've learned so much from John already, and I know I still have a long way to go. I want to help others learn the same way I did. His words were met with nods of agreement from the rest of the team. They had seen the power of mentorship firsthand. It wasn't just about passing on skills, it was about passing on the values of patience, respect, and teamwork. John smiled, the weight of the decision settling in. It was a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire company. They weren't just building a business, they were building a legacy. And he was proud to be a part of that. The team left the meeting energized, ready to take on the next challenge. The mentorship program was just the beginning. John knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, but with the strength of the team behind him, he felt ready for whatever came next. As he walked back to his desk, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. From the days when he was just the quiet veteran in the corner to now, when he was leading the charge into a new era for the company, it had been a journey of growth, not just for the company, but for him, too. The respect he had earned wasn't just from his knowledge or his skills, it was from the way he had helped others grow. And that was something that no title or position could ever replace. As the mentorship program took off, the office atmosphere reached a new level of collaboration. John Clark had become the cornerstone of the company's culture, not just as a leader but as a mentor who provided guidance, wisdom, and support. The mentorship program, which had started as a simple idea, was now becoming the heartbeat of the company, with employees eagerly seeking out opportunities to work under John's tutelage. He wasn't just teaching them about the job, he was teaching them how to approach life, how to handle challenges, and how to grow from setbacks. Mike, who had once been a skeptical young employee, was now one of John's most devoted ments. He had come to realize that John's experience wasn't just a collection of past accomplishments, it was a mindset, a way of thinking that could transform not only his career but his entire outlook on work and life. John, Mike said one day after a particularly productive session, I've been thinking about how much I've learned from you. Not just the technical stuff, but how to approach problems, how to stay calm when things get tough. I never really understood the value of experience until now. John smiled, his calm demeanor never wavering. Experience is about learning from your mistakes and growing from them. It's about understanding that no challenge is insurmountable if you take the time to think it through. You'll make your own mistakes, Mike, but that's how you learn. Don't fear them, embrace them. Mike nodded, absorbing John's words. It was the kind of advice that only someone with years of experience could give, and it was exactly what he needed. The team, under John's guidance, had become more than just co-workers. They were a unit, supporting each other, learning from each other, and working toward a common goal. They were no longer focused on individual achievements but on collective success. John's influence was evident in the way the team approached challenges. They no longer saw obstacles as insurmountable walls but as opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow. Even the most difficult problems became puzzles to solve, rather than crises to endure. One afternoon, Greg Thompson called John into his office again. The company had reached a critical point in its growth, and Greg wanted to discuss the next steps. "John, you've done more for this company than I could have imagined," Greg said, his tone sincere. "We've grown stronger, more focused, and more united because of you. The team is working together like never before. But we're about to face some new challenges, bigger challenges. And I want you to be a part of guiding us through that." John listened carefully, his mind already thinking ahead. "I'm here to help," he said simply. "But it's not just about me. It's about the team. They're the ones who have to carry this forward. I'm just giving them the tools to succeed." Greg nodded, appreciating John's humility. "That's why I want you to take on an even bigger role. Not just with the team, but with the entire company. We need your guidance, John. We need your experience to shape the future of this company." John paused, considering the offer. He had never sought a leadership position. His satisfaction had always come from helping others find their own way. But as he thought about it, he realized that his work was far from done. The team was ready for the next level, and so was he. "I'll do it," John said, finally. "But only if I can continue to work closely with the team. They're the heart of this company." Greg smiled, clearly pleased with John's response. "Of course. Your role will evolve, but you'll still be at the center of it all. You'll be leading the charge, but you won't be doing it alone." As John left the meeting, he felt a new sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew that with the team by his side, they could face whatever challenges came their way. He had already helped them grow, helped them become a stronger, more unified group. Now, it was time to help the company grow, to lead it into the future. And as always, he would do it with the same calm, steady approach that had served him well throughout his life. The team had learned to trust him, to rely on his experience and wisdom. And in turn, they had become the kind of team that could face any challenge and emerge stronger for it. The journey was far from over, but John knew that together, they would succeed. As the months went by, John Clark's role continued to evolve. The company had gone from a place of uncertainty to a well-oiled machine, thanks in no small part to the culture John had helped foster. He had turned the team into something far greater than just a group of employees. They were now a community, united by respect, shared knowledge, and a common purpose. With every passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. The mentorship program continued to thrive, and John became a living example of the values they had all come to cherish: patience, humility, and perseverance. The team's growth was evident, not just in their work but in the way they approached each new challenge. They were no longer reactive, they were proactive, thinking ahead, planning for what came next. Mike, once the most skeptical, had fully embraced the lessons John had taught him. He had become a leader in his own right, passing on the same wisdom to his own men's. The cycle of learning and growth was now deeply embedded in the company's culture. One day, Greg Thompson, the CEO, called for a meeting to discuss the future of the company. "We've reached a pivotal point," Greg began, his voice full of confidence. "The success we've seen in the past year is a direct result of the changes we've made. But we're not done yet. It's time to think bigger. It's time to think about how we expand this culture of growth beyond just our team. We need to make sure that the work we've done here becomes the foundation for the future of this company." He paused for a moment, scanning the room. "And that's where John comes in. We need him to help guide this vision. He's already done it with the team, now it's time for him to help us take this to the next level." John, who had been quietly listening, looked up at Greg. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," he said, his voice calm as ever. "I've done what I can with the team, but the company is a much bigger challenge." Greg smiled. "John, you've already proven that you know how to build something lasting. You've shown us what true leadership looks like. We need your experience and your steady hand to help us grow, not just in size but in strength." John thought for a moment, the weight of the decision settling in. He had never been one for recognition or power, but the company's success, and the success of his team, meant more to him than anything. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help guide the company, but only if I can continue to work with the people who matter most, the team. They've been the heart of everything we've done." Greg nodded. "Of course. You'll be at the forefront, but you won't be doing it alone. We're all in this together." The next few months saw John taking on a new leadership role, one that involved guiding the company's expansion and ensuring that the values that had brought them success were maintained as they grew. His approach didn't change, he continued to lead with the same quiet strength, teaching others the value of listening, of thinking through problems, and of working together. The company began to flourish even more, with each department embracing the culture John had helped create. The mentorship program expanded, with new leaders emerging, each one eager to share their knowledge and experience with others. The transformation was complete. What had once been a company struggling to find its footing was now a model of collaboration, respect, and growth. John, ever humble, remained at the center of it all. He didn't seek the spotlight, he didn't need recognition. His reward was seeing the team succeed, seeing them grow, and knowing that he had played a part in shaping their future. As John walked through the office one evening, looking out over the team hard at work, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. They had done it. Together, they had built something lasting. And as the company moved into the future, John knew that the lessons they had learned from each other would continue to guide them, no matter what challenges lay ahead.